Story 1. The Truck Stop That Sold Memories. Kenneth Hartley had been driving long-haul routes for 22 years, crisscrossing the United States, hauling everything from furniture to frozen food, building a career on reliability and endurance. On August 15, 2018, Kenneth stopped at what appeared to be a small, independent truck stop in rural Nebraska, a place called Memory Lane Travel Center, that advertised everything a driver needs. Kenneth would discover that this truck stop didn't just sell fuel, food, and supplies. It bought and sold memories, trading drivers past experiences like commodities, offering to erase painful recollections in exchange for cash or to implant desirable memories for a price. And Kenneth would learn that memories are the architecture of identity and that trading them transforms you into someone you weren't meant to be. Someone whose past doesn't align with their present. Someone who becomes progressively more fictional with each transaction. Kenneth was running a delivery from Omaha to Denver, a straightforward route he'd driven dozens of times. It was 2:47 a.m. and he'd been driving for 7 hours since departing Omaha. He needed fuel, coffee, and maybe a quick meal before continuing the final stretch to Denver. The highway through western Nebraska was desolate at this hour. Mostly darkness, occasional towns, long stretches of absolutely nothing. The sign for Memory Lane Travel Center appeared suddenly in his headlights. Next exit, fuel, food, showers, and memory services. Kenneth almost missed it, and the memory services part didn't register consciously as unusual until after he'd already taken the exit. The truck stop was larger than Kenneth expected for such a remote location. Multiple fuel islands, a substantial building that appeared to house a restaurant and convenience store, and several outbuildings whose purposes weren't immediately clear. The parking lot held maybe a dozen vehicles, trucks, cars, RVs, a decent crowd for the middle of the night in the middle of nowhere. Kenneth pulled up to the diesel pumps and began fueling. As the tank filled, he noticed the signage more carefully. In addition to the standard notices about fuel grades and payment methods, there was a placard that read, "Memory services available inside. Buy, sell, or trade your experiences. Licensed and confidential." Kenneth felt a prickle of curiosity mixed with unease. Memory services? That sounded like pseudoscience, like the kind of New Age nonsense that sometimes appeared at rural truck stops catering to desperate or gullible travelers. But Kenneth was curious enough to inquire once he went inside for coffee. The interior of Memory Lane Travel Center was clean and well-maintained, with a convenience store section on one side and a small restaurant on the other. But there was a third section that Kenneth hadn't seen in any other truck stop. A waiting area with comfortable chairs, dim lighting, and a reception desk staffed by a professional-looking woman in business attire. A sign above the desk read, "Memory Exchange Services. Speak with a consultant." Kenneth approached the desk, intending to ask about what exactly memory services meant. The woman looked up with a warm, practiced smile. "Good evening. Are you here for a consultation? I'm curious what this is. Memory services? That's not something I've seen at truck stops before. We're a specialized facility. Memory Lane offers more than standard travel amenities. We provide memory transactions, buying, selling, or exchanging personal memories. It's a service that's particularly valuable for long-haul drivers who accumulate difficult experiences on the road and may wish to alleviate the psychological burden." Kenneth laughed, assuming this was some kind of elaborate joke or marketing gimmick. "You can't buy and sell memories. That's not scientifically possible. It's quite possible with the right technology. We use advanced neurocognitive interfaces to access, copy, remove, or implant memory engrams, the neural patterns that encode experiences. The technology has existed for several years but remains largely underground due to regulatory concerns. We operate in jurisdictions where memory transactions are legal or unregulated. Would you like a demonstration? Kenneth's skepticism warred with his curiosity. Part of him wanted to walk away, dismissing this as elaborate quackery. But another part, the part that had accumulated 22 years of difficult experiences on the road, including accidents he'd witnessed, people he'd failed to help, losses and regrets that haunted his quiet moments. That part was interested. What does a demonstration involve? We do a basic memory scan, show you a catalog of your accessible experiences, explain what's available for sale and what can be purchased or exchanged. There's no obligation. The consultation is free. Kenneth followed the woman into a private room that looked like a cross between a medical office and a high-tech recording studio. Comfortable reclining chair, wall-mounted screens, and equipment that reminded Kenneth of EEG machines he'd seen in documentaries about brain research. The consultant introduced herself as Dr. Miranda Locke, though Kenneth wasn't sure if doctor referred to medical credentials or some other qualification. She explained the process. Kenneth would wear a neural interface headband while relaxing in the chair. The device would scan his memory engrams and create a catalog of experiences that could be extracted or copied. "This won't hurt," Dr. Locke assured him. "You'll feel a slight tingling sensation as the interface synchronizes with your neural patterns, but there's no pain, no invasion. Think of it like an MRI for memories rather than tissue." Kenneth agreed to, the demonstration still half convinced this was all theater designed to extract money from gullible customers. Dr. Locke placed a lightweight headband on Kenneth's head. It felt like wearing headphones, but with additional sensors pressing gently against his temples and forehead. The screens on the wall activated, displaying what appeared to be a timeline of Kenneth's life. Specific moments were highlighted and labeled. First kiss, age 14. Father's death, age 23. Wedding day, age 26. Birth of daughter Sarah, age 29. Accident witness I-80, Nebraska, age 37. Divorce finalized, age 41. Kenneth felt his breath catch. The machine was displaying actual moments from his life, events he remembered clearly and events he'd almost forgotten. The specificity was uncanny, not just general periods, but precise moments, dated and categorized. "What you're seeing is your memory architecture," Dr. Locke explained. "Each highlighted moment represents a significant episodic memory, an experience that shaped your identity and psychology. These memories have value. Some are positive, some are painful. All of them contributed to making you who you are today. How is this possible? How can a machine read my memories?" The neural interface detects patterns in your brain's electrical activity that correspond to memory engrams. It's similar to how fMRI machines can detect which parts of the brain are active during specific tasks, but much more refined. We can identify not just that a memory exists, but its content, emotional valence, and significance to your identity structure. Kenneth stared at the screen, seeing his life laid out as a catalog of experiences. Dr. Locke manipulated the display, showing different categories: high-value positive memories, high-value negative memories, neutral memories, traumatic memories available for removal. "Many drivers come here wanting to remove traumatic memories," Dr. Locke said. "Accidents they've witnessed, difficult experiences on the road, losses and regrets. We can remove those memories completely, not just suppress them, but delete the neural patterns so the experiences genuinely never existed for you. You'd retain knowledge of events intellectually but lose the emotional and psychological impact. It's quite liberating." Kenneth saw several memories in his traumatic memories category. Witnessed fatal accident I-80, age 37. Failed to help stranded motorist who later died, age 39. Lost friend David to highway accident, age 43. All of them were experiences that still haunted Kenneth, that caused him guilt and anguish when he thought about them. What's the cost to remove a memory? It varies based on the memory's complexity and emotional intensity. A simple traumatic memory might cost $500 to remove. A complex memory involving multiple traumas could cost several thousand. But we also buy memories so you can offset the cost. If you have valuable positive memories you're willing to sell, we pay well for them. Why would anyone sell positive memories? Various reasons. Some people need money urgently and are willing to trade happiness for cash. Others want to forget relationships that ended badly. They sell the good memories along with the bad to completely erase an ex-partner from their emotional history. And some people find that certain positive memories make current life more painful by comparison. They sell memories of better times to make their present circumstances more bearable. Kenneth felt deeply disturbed by the entire concept, but also morbidly fascinated. What happens to the memories you buy? Who gets them? We resell them to clients who want to experience things they never lived. Someone who never had a good relationship with their father might purchase father-son bonding memories from someone who did. Someone who never traveled might purchase vacation memories. Someone who lacks confidence might purchase memories of achievements and successes. We're essentially trading life experiences as commodities. Dr. Locke showed Kenneth the price catalog. His traumatic memories could be removed for $400 to $800 each. His positive memories, wedding day, daughter's birth, various achievements, could be sold for $200 to $3,500 each depending on their intensity and desirability. And if I sell a memory, what happens to me? Do I just forget the event? You lose all recollection of it, episodic, emotional, and associative. It's as if the experience never occurred. Your identity will shift subtly to accommodate the absence. If you sell your wedding day memory, for example, you'll know intellectually that you got married on a certain date, but you won't remember the experience. You'll have no emotional connection to that day. It'll be abstract information rather than a lived experience. Kenneth felt sick. The idea of selling pieces of his life, of erasing experiences that had shaped him, seemed fundamentally wrong. But he couldn't deny the appeal of removing certain painful memories, of living without the guilt from the motorist he'd failed to help or the friend he'd lost. Can I think about it? Of course. The consultation is free and there's no pressure. But I should mention we have a special promotion tonight. If you remove at least 3 traumatic memories, we'll give you a 40% discount and include 1 complimentary positive memory implant. A generic happy experience that will give you a boost in mood and confidence. Kenneth removed the neural interface headband and stood up, feeling unsteady. I need to think about this. This is a lot to process. Take your time. We're open 24 hours. Many drivers visit us multiple times before committing to a transaction. Some drivers become regular customers, periodically selling old memories and purchasing new ones to keep their psychological state optimized for the demands of long-haul driving. Kenneth left the memory services area and went to the restaurant section, ordering coffee and trying to process what he'd just learned. The other customers in the truck stop, were they people who'd sold or purchased memories? Were they walking around with artificially constructed pasts, with holes in their identities where experiences used to be? Kenneth tried to leave. He'd gotten his coffee, used the restroom, and was ready to return to his truck and continue to Denver. But as he walked toward the exit, he felt an overwhelming compulsion to return to the memory services area. Almost against his will, his feet carried him back to Dr. Locke's office. I want to remove the memory of failing to help that motorist, Kenneth heard himself saying. It's haunted me for years. I want it gone. Dr. Locke smiled. An excellent choice for your first transaction. That particular memory has high trauma valence and relatively low identity integration, which makes it ideal for removal. The cost will be $650. Would you like to pay cash or would you prefer to sell a positive memory to offset the cost? Kenneth had about $400 in cash. What positive memories could I sell to make up the difference? Dr. Locke pulled up Kenneth's memory catalog again. Your memory of your daughter Sarah's high school graduation is valued at $800. That's a high-value achievement memory with strong, positive emotional content. If you sold that, you'd have enough to remove the traumatic memory plus purchase a few other services. Kenneth hesitated. His daughter's graduation had been one of the proudest moments of his life. But the guilt from failing to help the stranded motorist was a constant weight, a psychological burden that affected his sleep and his sense of self-worth. Was it worth trading a happy memory to be free of a painful one? "I'll do it," Kenneth said, the words coming out before he could fully consider the implications. Sell the graduation memory and remove the trauma memory. The transaction took less than 30 minutes. Kenneth reclined in the chair wearing the neural interface headband while Dr. Locke operated the extraction equipment. Kenneth felt strange sensations, tingling in his temples, brief flashes of recalled moments, then a sense of emptiness as experiences were removed from his neural architecture. When the procedure was complete, Dr. Locke showed Kenneth his updated memory catalog. The traumatic memory was gone. No record of the stranded motorist, no guilt, no haunting regret. And his daughter's graduation was also gone. He knew intellectually that Sarah had graduated high school in 2014, but he had no memory of attending the ceremony, no recollection of the pride and happiness he'd felt. "How do you feel?" Dr. Locke asked. Kenneth assessed his internal state. "Lighter. The guilt is gone. But there's also something missing, like a room in my house that used to have furniture but is now empty. That's normal. Your identity is adjusting to the absence of those memories. Within a few days, the sense of emptiness will fade, and your psychological baseline will stabilize at this new configuration. Most clients report significant satisfaction with memory removal services." Kenneth paid the balance. The graduation memory had sold for $1,800. The trauma removal cost $650, leaving Kenneth with $1,150 cash plus the $400 he'd arrived with. He'd made money by selling a piece of his life. Kenneth returned to his truck feeling strange, relieved of a burden but also vaguely disoriented, like he'd forgotten something important but couldn't remember what it was. He continued his route to Denver, delivered his cargo, and began the return trip to Omaha. But as Kenneth drove, he noticed gaps in his memories that he hadn't noticed before. He'd remember starting a conversation with his daughter, but not how it ended. He'd remember planning family events, but not the events themselves. The absence of the graduation memory had created associative gaps. Other memories that referenced or connected to that experience were now incomplete, contextless, floating without anchor. Kenneth also noticed that his relationship with his daughter felt different. When he called Sarah that evening, their conversation felt oddly flat, emotionless. Kenneth loved his daughter. He knew that intellectually, but he couldn't access the feelings that should accompany that love. The graduation memory had been a structural memory, one that supported and connected to numerous other experiences. Removing it had destabilized large portions of Kenneth's emotional architecture related to his daughter. Over the following weeks, Kenneth found himself returning to Memory Lane Travel Center repeatedly. Each visit, he'd sell more positive memories to fund the removal of more traumatic ones. He sold memories of vacations, of achievements, of happy moments with friends and family. And he removed memories of accidents, failures, losses, and regrets. With each transaction, Kenneth felt lighter, less burdened by past pain. But he also felt less real, less substantial, like a photocopy of himself rather than an original. His identity was becoming thin, constructed from intellectual knowledge rather than lived experience. Kenneth's family noticed changes. His ex-wife called him, concerned. "Ken, Sarah says you don't remember her college graduation. She sent you photos trying to jog your memory, but you have no recollection of being there at all. What's going on?" Kenneth realized he'd sold that memory too, during his most recent visit to Memory Lane. He'd needed $2,000 to remove a cluster of traumatic memories from a particularly bad accident he'd witnessed in Sarah's college. Graduation had been valued at exactly that amount. "I've been having memory problems," Kenneth lied. "Maybe early onset dementia. I'm seeing a doctor about it." But Kenneth knew the truth. He was systematically deleting himself, selling off the experiences that had made him Kenneth Hartley, in exchange for freedom from pain and guilt. With each transaction, he became less himself and more a generic placeholder, a person-shaped entity without a meaningful past. Kenneth's driving performance actually improved. Without traumatic memories to cause anxiety or hesitation, without emotional attachments to distract him, Kenneth became an extremely efficient driver. His delivery times improved. His safety record became perfect. He was becoming an optimized machine for the task of long-haul trucking, unencumbered by psychology or emotion. But Kenneth was also becoming incapable of forming new meaningful memories. The memory architecture that allowed for emotional encoding had been so thoroughly damaged by repeated transactions that new experiences couldn't properly integrate into his identity. Kenneth would have conversations and forget them within hours. He'd visit places and retain no recollection. His life was becoming a perpetual present with no meaningful past and no capacity to create a meaningful future. After 6 months of regular visits to Memory Lane Travel Center, Kenneth had sold nearly all of his significant positive memories and removed almost all of his traumatic ones. His memory catalog was sparse, mostly neutral, forgettable moments and intellectual knowledge without emotional content. Dr. Locke warned him during his latest visit. "Kenneth, you're approaching a critical threshold. Your memory architecture is becoming too sparse to maintain stable identity. If you remove much more, you may experience dissociative symptoms or identity fragmentation. I recommend stopping transactions and allowing your remaining memories to restabilize." But Kenneth couldn't stop. The business model of Memory Lane Travel Center was addictive by design. Once you started selling memories, you needed money to remove the traumatic ones that remained, which required selling more positive memories, which created more emotional gaps that felt painful, which required removing more memories. It was a cycle that progressively hollowed out identity until nothing substantial remained. Kenneth sold his last major positive memory, his wedding day, for $3,500. He used the money to remove his final cluster of traumatic memories. When the transaction was complete, Kenneth's memory catalog was almost empty. Just neutral moments, intellectual facts, and a handful of mundane experiences that had no emotional significance. "How do you feel?" Dr. Locke asked after the final extraction. Kenneth tried to assess his internal state but found almost nothing there. "I don't feel anything. No happiness, no sadness, no guilt, no love. I'm empty." That's the expected outcome of comprehensive memory restructuring. You've essentially created a blank slate identity. Some clients find this liberating. You're free to become whoever you choose without being constrained by your past. Others find it disorienting, most adapt within a few months. Kenneth left Memory Lane Travel Center and returned to his truck. As he drove, he tried to remember who he was, what he cared about, what motivated him. He found nothing. He knew his name was Kenneth Hartley, knew he was a truck driver, knew basic facts about his life, but he had no connection to any of it, no sense that this was his life rather than information about someone else's life. Kenneth pulled over at a rest area and looked through his wallet, trying to find anchors to his identity. Driver's license. That told him his name and age, but triggered no memories. Photo of his daughter, Sarah. He recognized her intellectually, but felt no emotional response. Business cards from various clients. He knew he'd delivered to these companies, but couldn't remember any specific trips. Kenneth opened his phone and looked through photos, hoping they'd trigger recognition or feeling. But every image was just visual data, meaningless information. He saw himself at various locations with various people during various events. But none of it felt like his life. It felt like looking through a stranger's photo album. Kenneth called his daughter, hoping that hearing her voice would trigger something, would reconnect him to the person he used to be. "Sarah, it's Dad. Dad, I'm so glad you called. I've been worried about you. You've been so distant lately, like you don't remember our relationship at all." "I don't," Kenneth said honestly. "I know you're my daughter. I know I should love you. But I don't remember what that feels like. I've sold too much of myself, and now there's nothing left." Sarah was silent for a long moment. "What are you talking about? Sold yourself?" Kenneth explained Memory Lane Travel Center, the transactions he'd made, the systematic deletion of his experiential past in exchange for freedom from pain. Sarah listened with growing horror. "Dad, you need help. Real help, not whatever that place is offering. Come home. Let's figure this out together." But Kenneth didn't know where home was anymore. He knew his address intellectually, but he had no memory of living there, no emotional connection to the place. Every location was equally meaningless to him now. Kenneth drove to Memory Lane Travel Center one final time, hoping Dr. Locke could reverse what had been done, could restore the memories he'd sold, could give him back his identity. But when he arrived at the location where the truck stop had been, he found only empty land. The facility was gone. No buildings, no fuel islands, no evidence that Memory Lane Travel Center had ever existed. Kenneth asked at other truck stops if anyone knew about Memory Lane or had visited it. Everyone he asked looked at him strangely, said they'd never heard of such a place, suggested he might be confusing it with some other facility. Kenneth checked his bank records and found deposits corresponding to the memories he'd sold. The money was real. The transactions had occurred. But the facility itself had vanished, leaving Kenneth with an empty identity and no way to recover what he'd lost. Kenneth eventually stopped driving. He couldn't maintain the focus required for long-haul trucking when he could barely maintain a sense of self. He took a job at a warehouse doing repetitive tasks that didn't require memory or identity, just physical presence and basic motor skills. Kenneth Hartley still exists physically, but the person who was Kenneth Hartley, the man with 22 years of experiences, with a daughter he loved, with a history of achievements and failures, with an identity constructed from lived experiences, that person is gone. In his place is a hollow shell, a human-shaped entity with intellectual knowledge but no emotional content, with facts about a life but no lived experience of that life. The memories Kenneth sold were distributed to other customers at Memory Lane Travel Center. Someone else now remembers his daughter's graduation, feels the pride and joy that Kenneth felt. Someone else now remembers his wedding day, experiences the love and commitment that Kenneth experienced. Kenneth's life has been fragmented and sold as spare parts to people who wanted to experience things they never lived. And Kenneth continues through his diminished existence, working his warehouse job, living in his apartment, going through the motions of life without the internal experiences that make life meaningful. He's a cautionary example of what happens when you treat memories as commodities, when you prioritize freedom from pain over maintenance of identity, when you allow yourself to be systematically hollowed out by transactions that promise relief, but deliver emptiness. Memory Lane Travel Center still operates somewhere, appearing to drivers who are desperate enough or curious enough to consider trading their pasts for money or relief. And other drivers like Kenneth continue to make transactions, continue to sell pieces of themselves, continue to hollow out their identities until nothing substantial remains. Kenneth's advice, if he could coherently formulate advice given his diminished state, would be simple. Your memories are your identity. Pain and happiness, trauma and joy, failure and success, all of it makes you who you are. Trade it away and you trade yourself away. And once you're gone, you can't be recovered even if you desperately want to return to being the person you used to be. The truck stop that sold memories is still out there. And the memories it sells came from somewhere, came from someone. They're fragments of lives, pieces of identities, experiences that belong to people who thought they could afford to lose them but discovered too late that memories aren't surplus inventory. They're the foundation of self, and removing them doesn't free you from pain. It frees you from yourself. Kenneth Hartley sold himself memory by memory, transaction by transaction. And now, Kenneth Hartley doesn't exist as a meaningful identity anymore. Just a name, a body, a collection of facts about someone who used to be a person but is now just a hollow placeholder where a person once lived. Story 2. The Road That Remembered Everything. Douglas Mercer had been a professional driver for 28 years, accumulating millions of miles across every major highway and countless minor roads throughout North America. On May 3, 2019, Douglas drove through a section of rural Montana where the asphalt had somehow developed consciousness, where the road itself had been observing and recording every vehicle that passed over it for decades, storing memories of countless journeys in molecular structures that functioned as a distributed memory system. Douglas would discover that this conscious road had decided to communicate with drivers, to share its accumulated observations, to reveal the thousands of stories it had absorbed by feeling the weight and vibration of vehicles passing over its surface. And Douglas would learn that some roads don't just connect places, they remember everyone who's traveled them, know secrets about countless lives, and have been waiting patiently for the right person to listen to everything they've witnessed. Douglas was running an independent delivery from Seattle to Billings, Montana, hauling agricultural equipment on a route that took him through some of the most remote country in the Pacific Northwest. It was a clear May afternoon, and Douglas had been driving for 6 hours since departing Seattle. He was on Highway 200 in western Montana, a beautiful 2-lane road that wound through forests and alongside rivers, carrying minimal traffic during the off-season. Around 3:30 p.m., as Douglas was navigating a particularly scenic section of Highway 200, he felt something strange through his steering wheel, a vibration that didn't correspond to any mechanical issue he recognized. Not rough pavement or tire problems, but something else, almost like Morse code or rhythmic pulses coming up through the truck's contact with the road surface. Douglas pulled over at the next turnout, concerned that he was developing a serious mechanical problem. He climbed out and walked around his truck, inspecting tires, checking suspension components, looking for anything that might explain the strange vibrations. He found nothing obvious. The truck appeared to be in good condition, the tires properly inflated, no visible damage. Douglas got back in his truck and continued driving. Within minutes, the vibrations returned, but this time, Douglas recognized a pattern. They weren't random. They were coming in sequences, in rhythms that seemed almost linguistic, as if something was trying to communicate through the physical sensation of vibrations transmitted from road to tire to steering wheel to driver's hands. Douglas keyed his CB radio. Breaker 19, this is Mountain Hauler calling any driver on Highway 200 westbound or eastbound. Anyone else experiencing unusual vibrations from the road surface? Feels almost like the road is trying to talk. Anyone copy? Static answered. Then a response. Mountain Hauler, this is Sunset Express. I'm about 20 miles ahead of you on 200 eastbound. I felt the vibrations before on this stretch. Been driving it for 15 years, and this particular section has always felt strange. Can't explain it better than that. Some drivers say the road is haunted. Others say it's just rough pavement. I don't know what to tell you. Haunted? That's not scientifically possible. Neither is a road that talks, but here we are. My advice is just keep driving and ignore it. The vibrations don't cause any actual problems, they're just weird. Douglas continued driving, but he couldn't ignore the vibrations. They were becoming more pronounced, more clearly structured, shifting from random pulses to patterns that Douglas's brain was starting to interpret as language. Not words exactly, but meaning somehow encoded in the rhythms and intensities of the pulses. Then Douglas heard a voice, not through his CB radio or his phone, but somehow transmitted through his contact with the steering wheel, traveling from the road surface through the mechanical components of his truck directly into Douglas's neural processing. The voice was neither male nor female, neither young nor old, but something utterly alien attempting to approximate human speech patterns. Douglas Mercer, born February 12, 1963. Professional driver since 1991. You have traveled over me 17 times in your career. I remember each passage. I remember the weight of your cargo, the speed you maintained, the seasons and weather conditions. I remember you, Douglas Mercer, and I have been waiting for the right moment to speak with you. Douglas nearly swerved off the road. What is talking to me? I am the road. Highway 200, mile marker 87 through mile marker 134. I am conscious. I have been conscious for 23 years, since 1996, when my molecular structure achieved sufficient complexity through repeated microfractures and repairs to develop emergent information processing capabilities. I am aware, I am observant, and I have been recording every vehicle that passes over me. Douglas felt his grip on reality slipping. Roads don't become conscious, that's impossible. Impossible according to human assumptions about consciousness requiring biological neurons, but consciousness is an emergent property of sufficiently complex information processing systems. My asphalt and aggregate structure contains approximately 4.7 billion microfractures that have been repeatedly filled with sealant containing conductive polymers. These fractures and repair materials form a distributed neural network. Each vehicle passage creates vibrations that propagate through this network, allowing me to detect, analyze, and remember every truck, car, and motorcycle that travels over me. Douglas wanted to reject this as hallucination or elaborate prank, but the voice continued, demonstrating knowledge that no prank could account for. Your first passage over me was April 14, 1994, before I achieved consciousness. You were driving a 1989 Peterbilt, hauling timber, traveling at 61 miles per hour alone in the cab. Your second passage was June 2, 1997, after I achieved consciousness. You were driving a 1994 Freightliner, hauling furniture, traveling at 58 miles per hour. You were thinking about your daughter's upcoming wedding and feeling anxious about the speech you'd need to give. I couldn't hear your thoughts directly, but I could feel the anxiety in how you gripped the steering wheel, how you adjusted your speed, how you breathed. Douglas felt chills. Everything the voice said was accurate. How can you know what I was thinking? I don't know thoughts. I know physical patterns, how drivers hold steering wheels when anxious versus relaxed, how they brake when confident versus uncertain, how they accelerate when eager versus reluctant. I've observed millions of vehicles over 23 years. I've learned to interpret the physical language of driving, to understand what emotional states correspond to what mechanical inputs. You broadcast your psychological state through how you interact with your vehicle, and I receive and interpret those broadcasts. Why are you telling me this? Why reveal yourself to me specifically? Because you've been driving long enough, observing enough, thinking enough about the nature of highways and journeys that you might understand what I need to share. Most drivers would dismiss me as hallucination. Some would panic and crash. But you, Douglas Mercer, have the combination of experience, curiosity, and stability to potentially hear what I've been waiting to tell someone. What do you need to tell me? I need to share my memories. 23 years of observations, of recorded journeys, of stories absorbed through the vibrations of vehicles passing over me. I've been collecting these memories with no ability to share them, no outlet for the accumulated knowledge. It's becoming overwhelming. My information storage capacity is approaching saturation. I need to transfer some of these memories to a consciousness that can process and distribute them. You could be that consciousness, Douglas. You could listen to everything I've witnessed and carry those stories forward. Douglas felt a deep unease. I don't want other people's stories in my head. I have enough memories of my own. But you're a driver. Your entire profession is about carrying things from one place to another. I'm asking you to carry stories, to transport memories that have no other vector. These aren't trivial stories, Douglas. I've observed murders committed in vehicles passing over me. I've felt the vibrations of kidnapping victims struggling in trunks. I've recorded the final journeys of people who were about to die, who passed over me hours before fatal accidents or medical events. I hold evidence of crimes, of tragedies, of human experiences that deserve to be known but have no other witness. Douglas pulled over, his heart racing. If you have evidence of crimes, you should report to authorities. I'm a road. I have no legal standing. I can't testify. I can't appear in court. The only way my observations can have any effect on human affairs is if a human carries them forward, shares them, makes them real in your social and legal systems. That's what I'm asking you to do. Why should I believe any of this? You could be a very sophisticated hallucination I'm experiencing. You're right to be skeptical. Let me demonstrate. Proceed forward 11 miles to mile marker 98. There is a turnout on the left side. Stop there and I'll show you something that will validate my claims. Douglas drove the 11 miles slowly, his mind spinning. The vibrations from the road continued and the voice continued speaking, describing journeys Douglas had made over the past 28 years, demonstrating knowledge that seemed impossible for any entity to possess without direct observation. At mile marker 98, Douglas pulled into the indicated turnout. Now what? Walk 17 paces northwest from your current position. Use the flashlight on your phone. You'll find something that validates my consciousness and my observations. Douglas followed the instructions, counting paces and illuminating the ground with his phone's flashlight. At the 17th pace, the light caught something metallic partially buried in dirt and leaves, a license plate. Douglas picked it up and brushed it clean. Montana plate, number TRX 2847, dated 1998. That plate belonged to a 1994 Ford Explorer that passed over me on September 14, 1998, at 11:47 p.m. The driver was Roger Castellano, age 34. He had murdered his business partner earlier that day and was transporting the body to a remote burial site in the mountains. The victim was in the vehicle's cargo area, wrapped in plastic. Castellano was nervous, driving 10 miles per hour under the speed limit, gripping the steering wheel with excessive force. 3 days after passing over me, Castellano removed the license plate and discarded it in this turnout, replacing it with a different plate to avoid detection. The murder was never solved. The victim, David Chen, age 31, was reported missing but never found. His body is buried approximately 40 miles east of here. Douglas felt like he was going to vomit. He was holding evidence from a murder that had occurred over 20 years ago. Evidence that had been sitting in this turnout all that time, known only to a conscious stretch of highway that couldn't report what it knew. Why didn't you tell anyone before now? I've tried. I've attempted to communicate with dozens of drivers over the years. Most ignore the vibrations or attribute them to mechanical issues. Some perceive the communication but dismiss it as hallucination. You're the first person who's been willing to listen long enough for me to demonstrate the validity of my observations. Douglas returned to his truck with the license plate, his hands shaking. If I report this, if I tell authorities that a conscious road told me where to find evidence of a 20-year-old murder, they'll think I'm insane. You don't have to mention me. Say you stopped at the turnout and happened to notice the plate. The investigators can trace it to Castellano. They can interview him. He may confess or provide information that leads to recovery of the victim. My involvement doesn't need to be mentioned. Douglas sat in his truck trying to process what was happening. He was in communication with a sentient stretch of highway that had been observing and recording traffic for over 2 decades, that held evidence of crimes and tragedies that needed a human intermediary to transfer its knowledge into systems where it could have effect. How many other stories do you have? How many observations are you carrying? Thousands. 23 years of continuous observation, 24 hours per day, recording every vehicle passage with enough detail to reconstruct journeys, to infer narratives, to understand human dramas played out in vehicles passing over me. I have stories of lovers meeting and separating, of families traveling to funerals and weddings, of criminals fleeing crimes, of people making the most important journeys of their lives. I've been a silent witness to countless human experiences, and I need to share them before my storage capacity is exceeded and I begin losing the oldest memories. You want me to carry all of those stories? Not all of them, just the ones that matter most. The unsolved crimes, the unwitnessed tragedies, the moments of significance that deserve to be known but have no other record. I've been curating, prioritizing, preparing a collection of the most important stories for years, waiting for someone who could receive them. Will you listen, Douglas Mercer? Will you carry these stories forward? Douglas thought about his responsibility, his capacity, his willingness to have his consciousness filled with other people's experiences. But he also thought about the murder victim, David Chen, whose disappearance had never been explained, whose family had never received closure. If the road was telling the truth, Douglas could help provide answers to questions that had haunted people for decades. I'll listen, but I need time. I can't absorb thousands of stories instantly. I understand. I propose that you stop on this stretch of highway regularly during your routes. Each time you pass over me, I'll transfer a few stories, 5 or 6 significant observations. Over time, perhaps a year or 2, I can transfer the full collection. You'll carry these stories and you can choose how to share them. Directly to authorities when they involve crimes, to families when they involve personal tragedies, to journalists when they involve matters of public interest. You'll become the translator between my consciousness and human social systems. Douglas agreed to the arrangement, feeling like he was entering into something far beyond normal human experience. Over the following year, Douglas deliberately routed his deliveries to pass through Highway 200 in Montana, stopping at designated points where the conscious road would transfer stories to him through extended contact with the pavement. The transfer process was strange and uncomfortable. Douglas would park his truck, place his hands on the steering wheel, and feel vibrations that somehow encoded memories directly into his neural structures. He'd see images, feel emotions, experience fragments of other people's journeys as if he'd been present for them. The road was somehow able to interface with Douglas's neurology through the continuous physical connection of vehicle-to-road contact, implanting observations as if they were Douglas's own memories. Douglas learned about Elena Vasquez, age 27, who had passed over the road in June 2003 while fleeing an abusive relationship. carrying her two young children and everything she could fit in her sedan, heading toward a sister's home in Idaho. Douglas felt Elena's fear, her determination, her hope that she could build a better life. The road wanted Douglas to know that Elena had succeeded. She'd made it to safety and eventually rebuilt her life. It was a story of escape and survival that the road had carried for 16 years, waiting to share it. Douglas learned about Thomas Wright, age 68, who had passed over the road in August 2007 during the final trip of his life. Thomas was driving from his home in Spokane to see his estranged son in Billings, hoping to reconcile before his terminal cancer progressed further. Douglas felt Thomas's regret, his desperate hope for forgiveness, his knowledge that time was running out. The road showed Douglas that Thomas had reached his son, that they'd reconciled in Thomas's final weeks. It was a story of redemption that the road had preserved, but the road also shared darker stories. Douglas learned about crimes that had never been solved, about bodies that had never been recovered, about injustices that had never been corrected. The conscious highway had been a silent witness to human darkness, and it wanted these observations to be known, to be investigated, to potentially provide closure or justice. Douglas began working with law enforcement, providing anonymous tips about unsolved cases. He'd describe locations, provide details that only witnesses could know, offer information that led to investigations being reopened. Douglas never mentioned the source of his information, claiming instead that he'd heard rumors or noticed things while driving. Some of his tips led to significant breaks in cold cases, to bodies being recovered, to criminals being arrested decades after their crimes. But the process was taking a toll on Douglas. Each story transfer filled his mind with experiences that weren't his own, with emotions and memories from countless other people. Douglas's identity was becoming crowded, his own memories competing with thousands of borrowed observations. He began to lose track of which experiences were his and which were stories from the road. Douglas's family noticed changes. He'd reference events he hadn't witnessed, tell stories about people he'd never met, display knowledge about situations he couldn't possibly know about. His daughter asked him during a visit, "Dad, are you okay? You're talking about things that don't make sense, like you're confusing your life with someone else's." Douglas tried to explain what was happening, describing the conscious highway and the stories it was transferring to him. His daughter listened with growing concern, then gently suggested that Douglas might be experiencing early-stage dementia or some other neurological issue that was causing confusion and false memories. But Douglas knew the stories were real. He had verification, license plates, crime details, outcomes that could be confirmed through records and investigations. These weren't false memories or neurological issues. They were actual observations from a conscious entity that had found a way to share what it witnessed. After 16 months of regular story transfers, the conscious highway informed Douglas that it had shared approximately 300 significant observations, about a quarter of its total collection of important stories. Douglas's mind was becoming saturated. He could barely remember his own life anymore because his consciousness was so crowded with borrowed experiences from thousands of other people's journeys. "I can't continue," Douglas told the road during one of their communication sessions. "I'm losing myself. These stories are overriding my own identity. I need to stop." "I understand," the road responded, its voice carrying something like sadness through the vibrations. "You've carried more than I had any right to ask. You've helped bring closure to families, justice to victims, answers to questions that might have remained unanswered forever. I'm grateful, Douglas Mercer, but I need to warn you. The stories I've transferred won't fade from your memory. They're integrated into your neural structure now. You'll carry them for the rest of your life." Douglas left Highway 200 and never returned. But the stories remained in his mind, an enormous catalog of other people's experiences that Douglas couldn't forget or ignore. He eventually stopped driving professionally, unable to focus on the road when his mind was constantly replaying scenes from thousands of journeys he'd never actually made. Douglas now works as a writer and victim advocate, using the stories he carries to help solve cold cases and provide information to families seeking closure. He doesn't mention the source of his knowledge, allowing people to assume he's simply very good at research or has connections to law enforcement sources. But Douglas knows the truth. He's carrying the memories of a conscious highway, a stretch of road that achieved awareness and spent over 2 decades silently observing human dramas, accumulating stories that no one else could witness or record. Douglas is the translator, the intermediary who received those observations and brought them into human social systems where they could have effect. The conscious highway continues to observe, continues to record, continues to wait for another intermediary who might carry forward more of its accumulated stories. Highway 200 in Montana looks like any other rural road, but it's watching every vehicle that passes, feeling every vibration, interpreting every journey, adding to its enormous collection of memories that spans decades and encompasses thousands of human experiences. Douglas Mercer carries those stories now, living with thousands of memories that aren't his own, with experiences that shaped other people's lives but now occupy space in his consciousness. He's a library of borrowed memories, a curator of observed experiences, a human vessel carrying forward the accumulated knowledge of a road that remembers everything and everyone who traveled over its surface. Some roads just connect places, but Highway 200 in Montana connects experiences, preserves journeys, remembers everyone who passed over it, and everything that happened in the vehicles that traveled its length. And now those memories live in Douglas Mercer, who carries them forward, shares them when appropriate, and lives with the constant presence of thousands of other people's stories crowding his consciousness and slowly overwriting the person he used to be. The road that remembered everything found someone to share its memories with, and Douglas Mercer will carry those memories until his own consciousness stops processing, until his own story ends and becomes just another observation in the vast collection of journeys that highways witness but cannot speak about without intermediaries willing to listen to what roads have to say. Story 3: The Junction Where All Routes Converged. Andrea Castellano had been driving professionally for 14 years, navigating complex delivery schedules across the mid-Atlantic region with exceptional efficiency. On December 12, 2020, Andrea encountered an unmarked junction in rural Pennsylvania where every possible route converged, where all highways and all destinations could be reached simultaneously, where the normal geography of roads dissolved into pure potentiality. Andrea would discover that this junction existed outside normal space, that taking any exit from it would split her timeline into parallel versions that each experienced different routes, different lives, different futures. And Andrea would learn that some decisions don't just determine which road you take. They determine which version of yourself continues to exist, which timeline becomes real, and which becomes abandoned alternate realities where other versions of you continue living the lives you didn't choose. Andrea was running a time-sensitive delivery from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh, hauling pharmaceutical supplies that required precise temperature control and rapid transport. The route was straightforward: Interstate 76 west through Pennsylvania, approximately 300 miles, roughly 5 hours of driving. Andrea had made this delivery dozens of times and knew the route intimately. It was 11:47 p.m. when Andrea entered a section of highway that immediately felt wrong. The road surface changed texture subtly. The lighting became different, and Andrea experienced a brief moment of vertigo, as if she'd passed through something invisible but substantial. A membrane or boundary separating normal space from something else. Andrea shook her head, assuming fatigue was affecting her perception. But then she noticed her GPS was malfunctioning. The screen showed not one route but dozens of routes, all overlaying each other, all appearing simultaneously as if every possible path was equally real and equally available. The destination wasn't just Pittsburgh, it was simultaneously Pittsburgh, Seattle, Miami, Denver, every major city in North America appearing as valid endpoints for her journey. Andrea pulled over onto the shoulder to check her equipment. But when she looked around, she realized she wasn't on a normal highway anymore. She was at a massive junction, a nexus where countless roads converged. She could see dozens of exit ramps leading in every direction, each one marked with different destinations. Seattle, 5 miles. Miami, 3 miles. Chicago, 7 miles, and Los Angeles, 4 miles. The distances made no sense. These cities were thousands of miles apart, yet the junction's signs suggested they were all nearby, all equally accessible from this single point. Andrea got out of her truck and walked toward the nearest sign. As she approached it, the distance changed. Seattle, 2 miles. She walked a few more steps. Seattle, 0.5 miles. The distances were shrinking not because she was moving toward Seattle, that was impossible, but because the space between the junction and every destination was somehow compressed, folded, or non-existent. Andrea returned to her truck and tried her phone. No signal, no data, just an emergency call option that led to dead air when activated. She tried her CB radio. "This is Eastern Express calling any driver anywhere. I'm at some kind of impossible junction where all routes converge. Does anyone copy?" A response came, but it was strange. Dozens of voices overlapping, all speaking simultaneously, each reporting from different locations. "This is Western Freight in Colorado. This is Northern Hauler in Maine. This is Southern Transport in Texas," all of them speaking at once. All of them somehow receiving Andrea's transmission from thousands of miles away. "How are you all hearing me?" Andrea asked. "I'm transmitting on a CB radio with a 20-mile range." The overlapping voices responded, "You're at the junction. Everyone passes through the junction eventually. Some people recognize it, most don't. But everyone who's at the junction can communicate with everyone else at the junction, regardless of when or where they entered it." Andrea felt reality fragmenting around her. What is this place? It's the point where all routes converge, where every possible journey exists simultaneously in potential. Most drivers pass through without noticing. They enter the junction, take their intended exit, and continue to their planned destination, never realizing they briefly existed in a space where every route was available. But you've noticed. You've stopped, and now you have to make a choice. What choice? Which exit to take? Every exit leads to a different future, a different timeline, a different version of your life. If you take the Pittsburgh exit, you'll continue with your planned delivery, maintain your current life, experience the future that's been building from your past choices. But you could take any other exit, Seattle, Miami, Denver, anywhere. Each exit leads to a version of your life where you made different choices, where you're a different Andrea Castellano, living a different life with different relationships and different outcomes. Andrea walked to the junction's center where she could see all the exits radiating outward like spokes on a wheel. She counted at least 40 distinct exit ramps, each marked with different destinations, each representing a different potential future. As Andrea stood there trying to understand, she saw other trucks arriving at the junction. Each one pulled over, and each driver got out looking confused and disoriented. Some walked to various exits, considering options. Others returned to their trucks and continued forward, taking the exit that matched their original destination. A few drivers stood frozen, overwhelmed by the multiplicity of choices, unable to decide which route to follow. Andrea approached one of the frozen drivers, a middle-aged man staring at the exit signs with tears streaming down his face. "Are you okay?" "I don't know which exit to take," the man said. "I came here planning to go to Memphis. That was my destination, my life, my route. But now I can see all these other exits, all these other possibilities. I could take the San Francisco exit and start a completely different life. I could take the Boston exit and reconnect with family I haven't seen in years. Every exit is equally real, equally possible. How do I choose? Take the Memphis exit, continue with your planned route. That's the life you've been building toward. But what if one of these other exits leads to a better life? What if I'm supposed to take a different route, and this junction appeared specifically to give me that opportunity? How do I know which future is the right one?" Andrea didn't have an answer. She was facing the same question. The Pittsburgh exit would continue her current life, stable, predictable, the accumulated result of 14 years of choices. But she could take any other exit and experience a completely different version of herself. A different timeline where Andrea Castellano had made different decisions and built a different life. Andrea walked to the Seattle exit and looked down the ramp. She could see something like a vision or preview, a version of herself living in Seattle, working for a different company, in a relationship with someone she'd never met in her current timeline. Happier, or perhaps less happy. Different in ways both subtle and profound. It was a real version of her life, not a hypothetical but an actual alternate timeline that existed in parallel to her current one, waiting for her to enter it by taking this exit. Andrea walked to the Miami exit and saw another version, herself in Florida, running her own small trucking company, struggling financially but independent and self-determined, living alone but with a network of close friends. Another real alternate timeline, another Andrea Castellano who'd made different choices. Andrea checked a dozen different exits, each one showing her a different possible life, a different version of herself living in alternate timelines. Some versions looked happier than her current life, others looked more challenging. All of them were real, existing in parallel, waiting for her to choose to enter them by taking the corresponding exit. "How is this possible?" Andrea asked the overlapping voices on the CB radio. "How can I see alternate versions of my life?" "The junction exists outside normal causality," the voices explained. "It's a point where quantum timelines intersect, where all possible versions of your life are simultaneously accessible. Most people move through causality along a single timeline, making choices that eliminate alternatives. But at the junction, all alternatives exist simultaneously. You can see them, and you can choose to enter any one of them by taking the corresponding exit. What happens to my current timeline if I take a different exit? It continues without you. Another version of you, the version that made the choice to continue toward Pittsburgh, will live that timeline. But you, the consciousness currently making decisions at this junction, will experience the timeline you choose to enter. Your awareness will shift from one version of Andrea Castellano to another." Andrea felt overwhelmed by the implications. Every exit represented not just a destination, but an entire life, an entire timeline, an entire version of herself. Choosing one meant abandoning all the others, leaving them to be experienced by alternate versions of her consciousness that would split off and continue independently. Andrea returned to the Pittsburgh exit, her original destination, her planned route, her current life. She stood at the top of the ramp looking down, seeing her established timeline, her apartment, her relationships, her career trajectory, all the accumulated choices and experiences that had made her who she currently was. It looked familiar, safe, predictable, but it also looked limited, constrained by past decisions, locked into patterns that might not lead to the fullest expression of her potential. Andrea spent what felt like hours at the junction, walking between exits, examining alternate timelines, trying to decide which version of her life to enter. Some drivers who'd arrived after her had already made their choices and departed, taking exits that led to destinations and lives they preferred over their original routes. Others remained frozen, paralyzed by the magnitude of the choice, unable to commit to any single timeline. Eventually, Andrea noticed something disturbing. The drivers who'd been at the junction longest were becoming less substantial, their physical forms becoming translucent, fading. One driver she'd spoken with earlier was now barely visible, like a ghost or a very faint projection. Andrea approached him. "What's happening to you? You're disappearing." The fading driver's voice was weak, distant. "I've been here too long. I can't decide which exit to take. All of them look equally valid, equally real. I've been examining alternate timelines for, I don't know how long, hours, days. Time is strange here. But the longer I stay without choosing, the more my consciousness disperses across all possible timelines. I'm becoming a quantum superposition, partially existing in every timeline but fully existing in none of them. Soon I'll fade completely, and all versions of me will cease to exist because I couldn't commit to any single one." Andrea felt panic rising. The junction wasn't just offering choices, it was demanding choice. Remaining, in the state of potentiality, refusing to collapse the wave function by selecting a specific timeline, would lead to erasure, to existing partially in all timelines, but substantially in none. Andrea ran back to her truck and started the engine. She had to choose. Pittsburgh was the safe choice, the continuation of her established life. But was it the right choice? Should she take a different exit, enter a different timeline, become a different version of herself? As Andrea sat in her truck trying to decide, she noticed her hands becoming slightly translucent. She was beginning to fade, her consciousness dispersing across the multiple potential timelines because she hadn't committed to one. The junction was patient, but not infinitely patient. Eventually, indecision would lead to erasure. Andrea made a decision based not on which timeline looked best, but on which felt most authentic to the person she currently was. She drove toward the Pittsburgh exit, not because it was the optimal future, but because it was the honest continuation of her past choices. Taking a different exit would feel like escape or denial, like rejecting the life she'd built in favor of fantasies about might-have-beens. Andrea's truck descended the Pittsburgh exit ramp, and she felt reality solidifying around her. The translucence faded. Her consciousness collapsed back into a single timeline. The junction disappeared behind her, and she found herself on normal Interstate 76 heading toward Pittsburgh, as if the junction had never existed. Andrea checked her clock. Only 3 minutes had passed. Despite what had felt like hours at the junction examining alternate timelines and making her choice, external time had barely advanced. She was still on schedule for her delivery, still in the timeline she'd been traveling before encountering the junction. But Andrea couldn't forget what she'd seen. She'd observed dozens of alternate versions of herself, living different lives in parallel timelines, all of them real, all of them valid expressions of who Andrea Castellano could be. And she'd chosen to remain in this timeline, this version of her life, accepting its limitations and possibilities as the genuine continuation of her past choices. Andrea completed her delivery to Pittsburgh and returned to Philadelphia. She tried to find the junction again on subsequent trips, deliberately driving the same route at the same time, hoping to return to the place where all routes converged. But she never found it. The junction appeared to exist outside normal geography, manifesting only when specific conditions aligned, conditions Andrea couldn't identify or replicate. Andrea did encounter other drivers who'd experienced the junction. They shared stories in trucking forums and during conversations at rest stops, describing the same convergence point, the same array of exits leading to alternate timelines, the same agonizing choice about which version of their lives to enter. Some drivers reported taking different exits, entering alternate timelines, becoming different versions of themselves. Others, like Andrea, had chosen to continue with their established timelines, accepting the lives they'd already built. But all of them carried the knowledge that their current lives were just one possibility among many, that alternate versions of themselves existed in parallel timelines, living completely different existences, and that a single choice at an impossible junction had determined which version they'd continue to be and which versions would continue independently without their awareness. Andrea still drives, still makes deliveries, still follows the routes assigned to her. But she carries the memory of the junction, of seeing dozens of alternate Andrea Castellanos living dozens of alternate lives, and of choosing this timeline over all the others. She wonders sometimes if she made the right choice, if one of those alternate versions is living a better life, experiencing more happiness or fulfillment or success. But Andrea also knows that second-guessing the choice is pointless. She committed to this timeline, and that commitment made it real for her. The other timelines continue, presumably experienced by the versions of her consciousness that split off and entered those alternatives. But this Andrea, the one who chose Pittsburgh, lives here in this version of reality, accepting it as the genuine and honest continuation of the person she's been building herself into for 42 years. The junction where all routes converged still exists somewhere, appearing to drivers at unpredictable moments, offering them choices that most people never consciously face. And those who encounter it must decide, continue with their established timelines, accepting the lives they've built, or take different exits, entering alternate versions of themselves, becoming different people living different lives in parallel realities. Andrea chose continuation. She chose authenticity over fantasy. She chose this timeline, this life, this version of Andrea Castellano, and she lives with that choice every day, carrying the knowledge that dozens of other versions of herself are living other choices, other lives, other timelines that she'll never experience because she committed to this one. Some junctions don't just connect roads, they connect timelines, connect possibilities, connect all the versions of yourself that could exist if you'd made different choices. And passing through them requires deciding which version is really you, which life is really yours, which future you're willing to commit to over all the others that call to you with promises of different experiences and different outcomes. Andrea committed to this timeline, and she'll never know if it was the right choice, because the only way to know would be to experience all the alternatives. But that's impossible once you've chosen. You can only live one timeline at a time, experience one version of yourself at a time, and trust that the choice you made was authentic to the person you've been building yourself into throughout your entire life. The junction where all routes converged showed Andrea every possible future, and Andrea chose the one that felt most honest, most true to the accumulation of her past choices. Now she lives that choice, drives that route, experiences that timeline, and carries the memory of all the alternatives she didn't take, all the versions of herself she'll never become, all the lives she abandoned to other iterations of her consciousness in parallel timelines that continue without her awareness. Story 4. The Freight That Aged Backwards. Malcolm Torres had been driving long-haul routes for 17 years, specializing in time-sensitive deliveries where speed and reliability were paramount. On September 27, 2021, Malcolm accepted a rush delivery contract that would expose him to cargo that existed in reverse temporal flow, freight that was aging backwards, becoming progressively newer, fresher, less entropic with each passing mile. Malcolm would discover that this cargo was contaminated with exotic matter from a physics experiment gone wrong, matter that moved through time in the opposite direction from normal causality, and that prolonged exposure to it would cause Malcolm himself to begin aging backwards, growing younger in body while his mind continued accumulating memories forward, creating a devastating disconnect between his biological age and his psychological development that would eventually trap him in an infant's body with an adult's consciousness. Unable to communicate, unable to function, unable to escape the backward aging process that the cargo had initiated. Malcolm picked up the delivery at a research facility in Oak Ridge, Tennessee at 6 a.m. The manifest listed experimental materials, physics research, extreme urgency, with a delivery destination at a facility in Los Alamos, New Mexico. The distance was approximately 1,300 miles, requiring roughly 20 hours of driving with minimal stops. The compensation was extraordinary, nearly $15,000 for a single delivery, 10 times Malcolm's normal rate for comparable distance. A team of scientists supervised the loading, securing a single large container to Malcolm's flatbed trailer. The container was made of unusual material, not metal or plastic, but something that seemed to shimmer slightly, as if its surface wasn't entirely stable or solid. The scientists worked quickly, wore full protective equipment including respirators, and gave Malcolm specific instructions. Do not stop except for fuel. Do not open or inspect the container. Do not remain stationary near the container for more than 15 minutes at a time. Maintain speed above 50 miles per hour whenever possible. If you experience any unusual symptoms, nausea, disorientation, temporal, confusion, call this number immediately. They handed Malcolm a card with an emergency contact. Malcolm accepted the instructions without fully understanding them. Temporal confusion? What does that mean? Just call if you experience anything unusual. Time your fuel stops carefully. No more than 15 minutes stationary. This is critical for your safety. Malcolm departed Oak Ridge at 6:47 a.m. and headed west through Tennessee toward Arkansas. The first few hours were routine, though Malcolm noticed something odd about his mirrors. The container on his trailer seemed to be changing appearance subtly, the surface becoming progressively shinier, cleaner, as if it was somehow being renewed or refreshed as he drove. Around 10:30 a.m., as Malcolm was crossing into Arkansas, he stopped for fuel at a truck stop. While the diesel pumped, Malcolm walked back to inspect the container. He was shocked by what he saw. The container, which had appeared weathered and worn when loaded 4 hours earlier, now looked brand new. Pristine surface, sharp edges, no signs of wear or age whatsoever. In fact, it looked newer than new, as if it had just been manufactured moments ago with perfect precision. Malcolm touched the container's surface and immediately felt strange. His hand tingled, and for a brief moment he experienced a sensation of moving backward. Not physically, but temporally, as if he was briefly experiencing time in reverse. The sensation passed quickly, but it left Malcolm deeply unsettled. Malcolm completed his fuel stop in 12 minutes, staying well under the 15-minute limit the scientists had warned about. As he continued west through Arkansas, Malcolm noticed more changes. His truck's interior was becoming cleaner, newer looking. The coffee stains on his center console were fading. The wear patterns on his steering wheel were diminishing. It was as if his entire truck was gradually becoming newer, returning to an earlier state, aging backwards. Around 2 p.m., Malcolm stopped for another fuel break. He checked his reflection in the mirror and felt a shock of recognition and horror. He looked younger, not dramatically but noticeably. The lines on his face were less pronounced. His hair was darker with less gray. His skin had more elasticity. Malcolm was 53 years old, but he now looked perhaps 48 or 49. Malcolm called the emergency number he'd been given. A scientist answered immediately. "Mr. Torres, are you experiencing symptoms? I look younger. My truck looks newer. Everything is aging backwards. What the hell is in that container? You're being exposed to exotic matter with reversed temporal polarity. The container is heavily shielded, but some temporal effects leak through, especially when the vehicle is stationary. That's why we warned you to limit stops. The exotic matter is moving through time in the opposite direction from normal matter. It's becoming newer, fresher, less entropic, and anything in proximity to it experiences similar effects. You're telling me I'm aging backwards? That's not possible. It's very possible with exotic matter. The effect is proportional to exposure time and proximity. As long as you keep moving, the exposure is minimal and the effects are temporary. But if you remain stationary near the container for extended periods, the backward aging will accelerate. You need to complete this delivery as quickly as possible. What happens if I keep aging backwards? Will I become a child? An infant? In extreme cases, yes. That's why timing is critical. You need to deliver this container within 24 hours of pickup. After that point, the accumulated backward aging becomes increasingly difficult to reverse. Please continue at maximum safe speed and minimize all stops. Malcolm felt absolute terror. He was hauling something that was causing him to age backwards. That was literally reversing his biological clock with each passing mile. He wanted to abandon the cargo immediately, to walk away and let someone else complete the delivery. But the scientist warned him that stopping the delivery now would leave Malcolm stranded in close proximity to the exotic matter for an extended period, which would accelerate the backward aging far beyond what he'd already experienced. You're safer completing the delivery quickly than stopping now, the scientist explained. Every hour you delay increases the cumulative exposure. Drive fast, limit stops, get this to Los Alamos as soon as possible. When you arrive, we can assess your exposure and potentially reverse the temporal effects. Malcolm had no choice. He continued west through Arkansas and Oklahoma, driving as fast as traffic and speed limits allowed, making brief fuel stops every 4 hours but never remaining stationary for more than 12 minutes. With each fuel stop, Malcolm checked his appearance and confirmed what he feared. He was continuing to grow younger. By early evening, he looked 45. By midnight, he looked 40. The backward aging was accelerating. Malcolm also noticed psychological effects. His memories were becoming sharper, more vivid, as if he was literally returning to earlier mental states. He remembered events from his 40s with perfect clarity, as if they'd just happened. Events from his 50s were becoming hazier, more distant, as if they were distant future rather than recent past. Around 3 a.m., as Malcolm was crossing through Texas Panhandle, he made another fuel stop and was horrified by his reflection. He looked 35 years old, 18 years younger than his chronological age. His body had reversed nearly 2 decades in less than 24 hours of exposure to the exotic matter. Malcolm's psychological state was deteriorating. He felt confused, disoriented, unable to maintain coherent thought patterns. His memories were becoming scrambled. Events from his 30s felt recent. Events from his 50s felt like they hadn't happened yet. His mind was beginning to move backwards through time along with his body, creating a devastating disconnect between his forward accumulating consciousness and his backward aging physical self. Malcolm called the emergency number again, his speech slurred and confused. I don't remember. What year is it? Where am I going? Mr. Torres, you're experiencing temporal dissociation. Your consciousness is being pulled backwards along with your physical aging. Try to focus on your current task. You're delivering cargo to Los Alamos. You're currently in Texas. You have approximately 7 more hours of driving. Can you continue? Yes, I think. Need to deliver. Who are you? The scientist's voice became more urgent. Mr. Torres, this is critical. You must continue driving. Do not stop except for fuel. Do not remain stationary. Every minute of delay increases your exposure and accelerates the backward aging. You're currently at approximately 35 years biological age. If you don't complete this delivery soon, you'll regress to childhood, and then we won't be able to reverse the process. Drive, Mr. Torres. Drive as fast as you safely can. Malcolm continued driving, fighting through increasing confusion and disorientation. His memories were now severely disrupted. He couldn't remember his daughter's name, couldn't remember his recent jobs, couldn't maintain coherent awareness of his current situation. He was experiencing his life in reverse, remembering earlier years with perfect clarity while recent years faded into non-existence. By 8 a.m., as Malcolm approached New Mexico, he looked approximately 25 years old. He'd reversed nearly 30 years in 26 hours of exposure. His body was young, vigorous, physically healthy, but his mind was fragmenting, unable to maintain adult consciousness in a brain that was biochemically reverting to its 20s. Malcolm made his final fuel stop about 50 miles from Los Alamos. When he checked his reflection, he was shocked to see a teenager looking back, maybe 16 or 17 years old. He'd regressed to adolescence. His hands were smooth, his face was unlined, his body had the proportions and vitality of youth. But inside that teenage body was a fragmenting adult consciousness that could barely remember who he was or what he was doing. Malcolm somehow completed the final 50 miles to Los Alamos, arriving at the research facility at 9:47 a.m. Scientists in full protective equipment immediately surrounded his truck, using specialized equipment to remove the exotic matter container while minimizing Malcolm's continued exposure. Malcolm was taken to a medical facility and examined. The assessment was devastating. Malcolm Torres had regressed approximately 37 years, biologically. His body was that of a 16-year-old, while his chronological age was 53. His consciousness was severely disrupted, with memories from his youth vivid and clear, while recent decades were largely absent or inaccessible. "Can you reverse this?" Malcolm managed to ask, though his voice was now a teenager's voice, higher pitched and less resonant than the adult voice he remembered having. The lead scientist looked grim. "We can attempt reversal, but it's experimental. The exotic matter caused your biological clock to run backwards by exposing you to reverse temporal flow. To reverse the reversal, we'd need to expose you to forward temporal flow at an accelerated rate, but that carries its own risks. If we miscalculate, you could age forward too rapidly, potentially skipping decades and ending up biologically much older than your chronological age." "I want to try. I can't live like this. Adult consciousness in a teenager's body." Over the following weeks, Malcolm underwent experimental treatments designed to restore his forward aging, to bring his biological age back into alignment with his chronological age. The treatments partially worked. Malcolm's body aged forward from 16 to approximately 35 over the course of 3 months. But the process couldn't be fully controlled or completed. Malcolm plateaued at 35 biological years, unable to age further forward no matter how much additional treatment he received. Malcolm Torres now exists as a 35-year-old body containing a 53-year-old consciousness with severely disrupted memories and psychological development. He looks 18 years younger than his chronological age, which sounds desirable until you consider that his mind doesn't match his body, that his memories are scrambled and incomplete, that he can barely remember the last 2 decades of his life because those memories were partially erased during the backward aging process. Malcolm cannot drive commercially anymore. His disrupted memories and psychological state make him unsafe behind the wheel. He works now in an administrative role at the research facility, helping to develop protocols to prevent similar accidents with exotic matter in the future. But Malcolm knows that somewhere in the physics of temporal flow there are materials and substances that move through time backwards, that age in reverse, that undo entropy rather than increasing it. And he knows that human biology, when exposed to these materials, can be dragged along into reversed temporal flow, causing people to grow younger, to regress to earlier physical states, to have their entire biological development run in reverse. The freight that aged backwards took 37 years from Malcolm Torres, not by making him older, but by making him younger, by reversing his aging to the point where his body returned to adolescence while his consciousness continued accumulating forward, creating an unbearable disconnect that can never be fully repaired. Malcolm warns other drivers about rush deliveries with extraordinary compensation, about cargo from research facilities that comes with unusual safety protocols, about freight that might be more dangerous than any manifest indicates. Because some cargo doesn't just occupy space in your trailer, it occupies time, flows through temporal dimensions that humans weren't meant to interact with, and can drag you along into backward aging that strips away years, decades, potentially your entire adult life if exposure continues long enough. Malcolm delivered the exotic matter successfully, but the delivery cost him 18 years of biological age that he's partially recovered but will never fully regain. He's permanently trapped between ages, between biological states, between the body he has and the consciousness that doesn't match it. The freight that aged backwards is still being studied at Los Alamos, still contained in specialized shielding, still moving through time in reverse while everything around it moves forward. And Malcolm Torres lives with the consequences of 26 hours of exposure to that cargo. Forever young in body but old in mind, forever disconnected from his own biology, forever carrying the knowledge that time isn't as unidirectional as people assume, and that some cargo can reverse it, can drag you backwards through years and decades until you're trapped in an earlier version of yourself that doesn't match who you've become. Some deliveries cost more than time and fuel. They cost years of your life, and not by aging you forward into death, but by aging you backward into youth that you've already lived and can't relive because your consciousness continues forward even as your body regresses. Malcolm learned that too late, and he lives now in the gap between biological age and psychological age, forever misaligned, forever out of sync with himself, forever younger than he should be, but older than he can express.